G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about two of the main hidden causes of bunions that I see day to day. Now I think this is a really helpful topic of conversation for so many people because the way that we tend to look at bunions in the industry is a very backwards sort of a view where we see the fact that you have a bunion developed on the inside of that big toe, and we tend to look at ways to reduce that bunion as opposed to taking a step back and trying to understand the cause of those bunions and addressing those issues to allow any symptomatic treatment to have more of an effect or a more long-lasting effect, which is what we're all here for. So the really interesting thing about bunions that I find clinically is that most bunions tend to be the result of the way that you load up those areas. So we're talking about the types of shoes that you wear, but also the way that you use your feet when walking. And this is really interesting because depending on the type of shoe that you have, it can have a real detrimental effect on your entire foot, not just your toes. Now, these are a pair of barefoot shoes that I tend to wear a lot. I love them. The idea behind them, and one of the great benefits of most barefoot shoes or minimalist shoes, is that they have a relatively broader toe box. Now, this is really important for a whole range of different reasons, but the main one is basically that we need to let our toes be toes. And if we don't have enough space for our feet, we're really trying to jam those toes into a space that they're not designed to be in. And one of the consequences of that, among other things, is that we can start to develop a big toe that starts to do something different. That big toe can start to be angled and forced inwards, which causes the bump at the side to protrude a little bit more. But from my experiences, that bunion tends to be a consequence of the whole big toe being forced inwards towards the other toes. We can start to develop a really big callus around that, and it can ultimately become painful and tender. But again, if we're not understanding that potentially that big toe is starting to turn itself inwards a little bit more, potentially because the shoes and the toe box of that shoe is forcing that to happen, then again, any surgeries, any operations, any treatments that you do will only be so effective until we can start to allow those toes to expand a little bit better. So it goes without saying, one of the main things that I think we need to look at for anyone with bunions is to make sure that you can get some shoes that have a much broader toe box, or at the very least taking a look at your shoes to see how oppressive they may be for your feet. Now, the second thing that I think is overlooked a lot, and this one is probably the biggest cause of bunions that I see in most people, is that the way that you walk and the position that you put your feet can really challenge and change the way that you load up that big toe and that bunion area. What I mean by that is, we've covered this in a video previously on the channel, but when we're walking, ideally we're walking with our feet straight. And when we're walking with our feet straight, what this does is this allows us to translate the pressure and the force through the middle of our foot as we're pushing off in the way that our body is designed to. However, if you do start to walk and stand with your feet turned out, all of a sudden we're no longer walking through the middle of our foot, we're turning that foot outwards and we're starting to walk through the big toe and collapsing that arch a little bit more. And as I said before, what we tend to see a lot with bunions is that that big toe starts to be pushed inwards towards the other toes. And if you're turning your feet out and walking through that, then all of a sudden every single step you take every single day is perpetuating that same anatomical dysfunction. So again, you're putting all this time, energy, and hard-earned money into trying to resolve this bunion, and you're not trying to address the way that you're actually contacting the ground when you walk, then you're potentially missing the biggest fundamental cause of why your bunions have developed over a long period of time. And if you've watched a previous video that we've done here on the channel, you'll know that when we're trying to change the way that your foot is positioned when you're walking, we need to treat you as a leg, not just as a foot. And again, two of the main reasons that we see that people tend to walk with their feet turned out is that your body is inherently compensating for a restriction either at the front of your hip or at the base of that ankle. So for example, at the front of this hip, if this hip is tight, again, potentially from a lot of the sitting that we've been doing, then every time you try and take a step and walk through that back leg, your body doesn't have the range of motion at the front to allow that to happen normally. So what we tend to do by default is our body will then turn our leg out, rotate our entire leg out to bypass the need to tension up the front of the hip, bypasses that tightness, then all of a sudden we're now in this rotated position. It can create some tightness through your hip external rotators as well. But ideally what we want to do first is we want to try and release some of the tightness at the front of this hip and then go after some of that sort of accrued hip external rotation tightness at the back to allow us to be and express ourselves more linearly while we're walking and not let that foot turn out and dumping through that foot, putting all the pressure through that big toe, aggravating and sort of accruing that bunion-related dysfunction. By far the best way that I've ever seen to release a tight hip, particularly at the front, is via the couch stretch. So we want to make sure that this is very comfortable for you to do. So I'm going to do this on the ground because it is a more advanced version, but please feel free to do this exact same exercise on a chair or on a sofa or a couch, in whatever way you feel most comfortable doing this. But what we want to basically get you to do is we'll do this same side again. Is you want to get your knee and place it into the back corner of a wall or the back seat of a chair in this particular position. So we're getting the knee back in there. If you feel like you have problems with pressure on your knees, then please have a pillow or a cushion underneath. Obviously, the padding of a chair will hopefully help. We're going to bring our other leg up, and again, this will be easier in a more high kneeling or a standing position before doing it on a chair. And then all we want to get you to do is come up as far as you feel comfortable until you feel you've exposed some of that tightness at the front of your hips. Now, you might find that if you're very tight, you might have to be in this position in a more sort of horizontal position. Hang out here, allow this tissue to give, push your foot back into the surface that you're on, really try and activate the tight muscles at the front here. Then when you relax, you might find you can actually tolerate coming back a little bit further. Same thing, squeeze everything at the front, push your foot back into the wall or chair, and repeat that process, then relax, and then keep going back as far as you feel comfortable. Stay here for a few minutes, but only go as far as you feel comfortable being. Make sure you can breathe, make sure that you can talk, otherwise you're probably going a little bit too far into the stretch. And what this will allow you to do is that when you get up and walk again, you should automatically feel like it's a bit easier and a bit more comfortable, and it feels a little bit more natural to have your feet straighter when you walk. And then as you're addressing the bunion itself, we're now normalizing how you load up your feet, how you load up your toes, and getting out of that externally rotated shape and really forcing that big toe to dump inwards. Now, the second thing we want to do here is that, as I said before, when you spend so much time in an externally rotated leg position, the muscles that cause that external rotation can become tight. So it pays to do an exercise to try and undo some of that hip muscular tightness to again make it easier for you to live in this more linear, straightforward plane. So as with the couch stretch, we can do this stretch on a bench or a table or a chair. I'm going to do it on the ground again. It's a more advanced version, but please choose the surface that you feel the most comfortable with. So all we want to get you to do here, and I'll do this side just for the purposes of the camera. So again, we're going to be placing your shin or your foot on a bench or a seat or a table, if not the floor. I'm going to gently drop that entire leg down into an externally rotated position as far as you feel comfortable. Now you might find that you can only get to here, which is fine to start with. Try and keep your back as straight as possible. We're not bending forward as far as we can, where we're bending through your back and not your hip. We just want you to find a position that really exposes some of that muscular tightness in the side of the back of the hip. And then again, similar to the couch stretch, wherever that muscle feels tight, give it a squeeze, tense that butt cheek up, push your foot back down into the ground or the seat or the couch, whatever you're doing this on. Hold that for a couple of seconds. Then when you relax, you should find that you can actually dip down into a deeper position. Same thing again, give it a good squeeze, hold that for a few seconds, then relax. Keep repeating that process until you feel like you've had enough or until you feel you made some really, really good change. And then what you'll find again is you should automatically feel like it's easier to be in a more straightforward position. And then when you're walking around, you shouldn't feel like it feels as weird to have your feet straight. It might actually feel a little bit weird now to have your feet turned out, and you'll be able to tolerate this a little bit better. Again, improving the position of your foot so that you can load that bunion up a lot more, so that all the bunion specific treatment that you're doing is having a more genuine and long lasting effect going forwards. One of the main reasons we tend to turn our feet out and then bias that big toe more than we should be is if the front of the hip is tight, the ankle can also be tight at the same time. And it's the same concept as before, where when we're bending that ankle as far as we feel comfortable, then what we can tend to find is if you run into some ankle stiffness or some restriction, your entire leg will dump inwards and dump around that to allow you to go further. And again, that means that we're spending more time on the inside of that foot, perpetuating that big toe being forced inwards and again, exposing the intricacies of why that bunion is there in the first place. The exercise that I find best to remove a whole bunch of ankle restriction is the banded ankle stretch. Now, again, I get asked this a lot. Where you have the band may or may not be important based on how you feel. So if you find that you have the band below your ankle bone, or if you have the band above your ankle bone, I suggest that you test both out, because both can be highly effective depending on what you're trying to do and where your stiffness and tightness is. For me, I actually prefer to have it above the ankle, even though that goes against a lot of the joint mechanics that we're seeing in this position. But what I want to get you to do is, with your feet straight, so not letting that foot turn out, but keeping your foot straight, bending that back ankle as far as you feel comfortable. So we're not dropping down into a lunge, we're leaving that foot behind us, then we're bending that back ankle as far as you feel comfortable. What we're also trying to make sure that we do here is that when you run into the end of that ankle range, again, imagine the band's pulling behind me as always, don't let that knee start to dump inwards, because you're going to avoid that stiffness. You want to make sure that you're plowing through that stiffness as much as possible, freeing that up as much as possible, so that when you need that range of motion, when you're moving around or running and jumping or navigating stairs or doing something like that, that you can go through your foot, not around your foot, and express better mechanics. Now, again, whether you have that above the ankle or you have that below the ankle bone, really depends on where you feel the most stiffness tends to be, what gives you the best access to this, what makes you feel the best and gives you the best results. But ultimately, we want to get you to find what works best for you, so that when you are moving around again and walking again, you should automatically feel like that side, or the side that you've just stretched, is genuinely looser than what it was before doing that exercise. So I just wanted to stop in and talk about those things as well. We haven't even gotten to more bunion specific things like toe spaces, which can really help sort of force those toes to space out a little bit more and really try and encourage that big toe to normalize in terms of the direction that it is. We haven't really spoken about big toe mobilizations. We can really dig in there and try and mobilize that joint as much as possible. There's a whole bunch of muscular tightness that you might find you'll accrue through the inside of that leg that you can get to with a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball. There's a bunch of other strength exercises we can go through in terms of squats with a band, making sure that your feet are straight. You're really creating that external rotation. I've covered a bunch of these on the channel for different reasons before, so feel free to go and look for those. But let me know in the comments down below if you want me to do a separate video on the bunion specific things to try and help you sort of decrease those bunion symptoms. Ultimately, if you've had a bunion for a long time and the state of that big toe joint is such that it is now degraded and arthritic and it's very hard for that to come back again, that's fair enough. That may ultimately lead to some form of surgery if you've discussed that appropriately. But the main thing I wanted to push with this video is that we ultimately always need to take a step back and try and understand why these issues occur in the first place. Because if we're not looking for the cause of that bunion and the things that conspired against you to create that situation in your foot, potentially why it might be one foot and not the other, or why one foot might be worse than the other, then ultimately you're going to be at a disadvantage in terms of trying to expect these things to improve long term. So again, I genuinely hope that was helpful. Let me know down in the comments how you went, and we'll see you in the next one.